Hello everyone and welcome back to day 2 of the Magnus Invitational. We're still at round 1 and it's Jan Nepomniachtchi versus Fabiano Caruana, both of them members of the 2020 Candidates Tournament, which was so abruptly adjourned. And like I said, this is game 2 of their match, but game 1 was very interesting, but it ended in a draw. Jan went for his French defense, which he also used in the Candidates Tournament. Still deciding on whether or not to show that one, but I decided to skip to game 2 as it features a most interesting move. So without further ado, let's check it out. Jan with the white pieces opens with e4, and Fabi goes again for his e5 as he did in the candidates. He's playing obviously the Archangel's variation of the Ruy Lopez. Bishop to b5, we have the Ruy Lopez on the board, a6 Morphy's defense, bishop to a4, and knight to f6. We have castles, b5, bishop to b3, and now this bishop to c5, the modern Archangelsk, instead of bishop to b7. We have a4, white usually will challenge black's queenside pawns with this push. We have bishop to b7, and now d3, strengthening the center, preparing to develop the dark square bishop as well. Castles by Fabi, and bishop to g5 now. We have h6, challenging the bishop, bishop to h4, and bishop back to e7 now, not really enjoying this spin. And here we have a couple of captures. We have captures here. Queen captures on a8, and now comes knight to a3. Here there are some games in the database where bishop to g3 and the knight to c3 was played, but Nepo prepared something wild for Fabi here, knight to a3. And it is as of move 13 that we have a completely new game. So what's the idea? It attacks the b5 pawn, same as the knight from c3. However, here Nepo is actually preparing c4, and he doesn't want to block his pawn with knight to c3. Fabi defends it with queen to a5, and now bishop to d5. Before pushing c4, we have d6 by Fabi, and now c4. Now preparing to meet b4 with knight to c2, and then you can shift the knight over, for example, to e3 and then to f5, which will be an excellent square for the knight. However, after c4, Fabi captures, b captures on c4, we have knight captures attacking the queen, and the queen to b5 now. And now knight to e3 right away. And now from here the knight can again come to f5 or maybe g4 in the future. We have bishop to c8, preventing knight to f5, and now Nepo goes for bishop captures on f6, removes this tension on the bishop. We have bishop captures, and now queen to c2, adding a second attacker to the knight here, and also preparing to bring the rook into the game. We have bishop to d7 defending, and now rook to a1, just bringing the rook nicely to the only open file on the board. We have rook to b8, now putting pressure on the b2 pawn, and Nepo defends it with b3. And it's a very interesting position, especially since Nepo, as he did prepare that knight to a3 move, probably had these positions on the board, and it's hard to say if Fabi had positions that arise after knight to a3 on the board at home. So bishop back to d8, now the knight can move as the c7 pawn will be protected, and now bishop back to c4, attacking the queen, clearing the d5 square for the knight. We have queen to c5, and now comes h3, just taking away the g4 square from black's pieces, but also at some point the knight might come to g4. We have knight to b4, attacking Nepo's queen, putting pressure on the e3 pawn, and queen to d1 now. And now c6. Here Fabi is ready to strike in the center with d5, but rook to c1 by Nepo. Now preparing bishop captures on f7 check to win the queen on c5. So queen back to a7, and now Nepo strikes in the center first with the d4. We have e captures on d4, knight captures on d4, and now bishop to f6 with a double attack on the knight here. And now knight back to f3. Nepo doesn't like knight f5 as it just trades down pretty much everything after d5. You would get captures, bishop captures. You cannot capture with the knight because then the knight hangs. So bishop captures, knight captures, queen captures, and of course now bishop to e6. You go back after your pawn, you're down a pawn, so you want to win it back, and black would just have two bishops against two knights, so would be definitely interesting if anything else for black. So after bishop f6, Nepo doesn't like knight to f5, he goes back knight to f3, and queen to c7 now. We have queen to d2, again putting pressure on the knight, and c5 now, defending it, so now the rook can also join the game. We have rook to d1, putting pressure on the d6 pawn, and here bishop to c6. Offering that pawn for the e4 pawn, which Nepo declines. He goes knight to g4 instead, and he says, okay, I'm offering the e4 pawn for knight captures on f6. Are you willing to ruin your pawn structure for that e4 pawn? And interestingly, Fabi is willing to do it. Bishop to e7, you could play that, just get the bishop out of harm's way, also defend the d6 pawn one more time. But Fabi actually captures on e4. And now comes the moment we've been waiting for. Knight captures on f6 with check, g captures, and the queen to f4 now, putting pressure on the bishop and also the f6 pawn. And here, best for Fabi is bishop captures on f3. And after g captures, then you want to move the king, you bring the rook over here. But black can do the same. You can move the king and then bring the rook into the game. So it would be very interesting. However, Fabi played bishop to g6 here, and bishop to g6 loses the game terribly. So feel free to find this, pause the video and try to find this winning idea for white while I give you a couple of seconds. So amazing as it is, for those of you who were able to do it, the correct move is knight to h4. For those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it does seem weird that such a move is just winning for Nepo, but the problem is there's the obvious threat of knight captures, because you will not be able to recapture due to this pin here. So you might have some ideas on how to defend. For example, if king to h7, then rook captures on d6, and now you have problems, because after rook to b6, challenging the rook twice. Now again, if queen captures, you can just pick up the rook. Here the problem is knight to f5, and this is the move that was incredibly hard to find. And here you have some interesting choices, but none of them actually work. For example, if you decide to grab the knight, then just queen captures on f5 with check, king to g8, and then now queen to g6 with check. Or if king went to g7, then you would just capture here with check. So king to f8, queen captures with check, king to e8, you would go queen to h8 with check, king e7, and now finally queen captures on f6 with check, king here, and now you win the queen, or rather after queen captures, as there are no other moves, queen has to capture, and now just queen captures on f7 with mate. So this is what happens after knight f5 if bishop captures. And like I said, this is why I decided to show this game, as it's really just a monster move. And if you don't capture the knight, you could try something like king to g8. It seems like it solves all of your problems, but not really, because here white has bishop captures on f7. And here, amazingly, you could capture with the bishop, the king, or the queen, and all the moves lose. For example, if bishop captures, then you just run into a mating net with queen to g4 check, king to f8, and now queen to g7 check, king to e8, and now a nice queen to h8 followed by there are no moves. The rook covers d squares, knight covers e7, the king has no squares, you have to block with the bishop, and queen captures on g8 is checkmate. So that's what happens if you capture with the bishop. If you capture with the queen, well, then it's just the very ugly rook to d8 check. And since the knight covers g7, you can only give up the queen or move to the h file, which will be followed, of course, by queen to h6, queen to h6 checkmate. So not much to do there. And lastly, of course, but not leastly, if you don't capture with the bishop or with the queen, you could capture with the king, but then the problem is you allow this rook to move with check, with deadly purpose, and then of course it's just rook captures on f6 check, and you pick up the queen here. King captures, you pick up the queen, you attack the rook, and knight d5 defends the rook, attacks the queen, but now queen d8 check. Now if you capture here, just queen captures knight, so you might defend, but still in the end it works out for white. Knight e3, you cannot move the knight because then just queen captures rook, and if rook d6, then we have queen to c8 check, and after the king finally moves anywhere, you grab on c5, and now again there's a double attack on the knight and also attack on the rook, so completely winning for white. So incredible, but Fabi's bishop to g6 loses the game terribly to knight to h4. However, Nepo doesn't play it. He plays rook captures on d6, and now it is similar to the knight h4 idea, but now rook b6 actually defends for Fabi, because you don't have that in-between move that we've mentioned. And now you don't really have the option. Now, the only way to seek advantage would be to go for queen captures on h6, sacrifice the rook, but it doesn't work. Queen captures here with check, king f8, queen h6 check, king to e7, and now you could go for queen to e3 check, because you have to be careful. Rook d1 check with the queen covering h2, it's game over. So queen e3 check, and after, let's say, king d8, you can make some breathing room for the king, but still you are down the exchange. You do have a passed h pawn, so it's not all that bleak, but black should definitely be better. So after rook b6, Nepo decided just to trade. Rook captures on f6, we have queen captures on f4, and now rook captures on f4. And now we have this endgame where Nepo is still better, he's up a pawn, but it's not going to be easy. Knight to d3, attacking the rook, we have rook to g4, now preparing h4 and h5 to maybe win the bishop. Knight to b2, and now knight to e5, now with a double attack on the bishop, also defending the bishop here, preparing to recapture with the pawn. So knight captures, pawn captures, and king to g7 now. Just helping out with the defense. We have h4, preparing h5, but first rook to e6, pushing Nepo's knight back, knight to d7, and now h5, not allowing Nepo to push h5 himself, rook to f4, and now comes rook to c6, just defending that c5 pawn. Knight to e5, and now rook to d6, getting the rook out of harm's way. We have knight captures on g6, king captures, and rook to e4, and we reach this rook and pawn endgame where Nepo is still up a pawn. But like I said, it's not easy to convert a pawn up in rook's endgame, or sometimes it's even impossible. So rook d1 check, king h2, rook to c1, now just putting the rook behind the pawn, and king g3. We have rook to c2, now the rook is putting pressure on a lot of white pawns, and king to f3. We have king to f5, and now rook f4 check. King g6, we have g4, and now rook to c3, check. King to e2, h captures, rook captures with check, and king h5, just going after the pawn. Rook not there, rook to f4, going after the f7 pawn, and now comes king to g6, just defending. We have king to d2, and now rook back to h3. We have rook to g4 check, king f5, and rook to g5 check. King to e4, and now we have a nice trade of pawns. Rook captures on c5, rook captures on h4, and rook to d5. And now Nepo did create a passed c pawn, and he will of course try to push it. Rook h3, and now king to c2. We have rook to f3, going after the f2 pawn, and now rook to d2, defending, and also cutting off the black king from reaching the white pawn. So king e5, and now king to d1. We have king to e6, and now rook to c2. Of course, you have to put your rook behind the passed pawn. King to d6, and king to e2 now. So slowly but surely making progress. We have rook to a3, and now f3 by Nepo. King to c5, blocking the pawn, and now king to f2. We have rook to d3, and now rook to c1. Rook to d4, going after the pawn here, and king to e3. And here f5. Just advancing the pawn a little bit further, we have f4, and now here Fabi just played rook captures on c4, and it was in this position that they agreed to a draw, as it is in fact a draw. And if you're interested why it's a draw, because after the rooks are traded, there's no way to do anything about this. White cannot cross this the e4 and d4 squares, and black will not. It's irrelevant for black, because even if black wins the pawn, it's still a draw. For example, king e2, king d4, you're going to play king to f3, king d3, and now we're likely to have a repetition here. Or, like I said, you can even give up a pawn. King e3, king g2 captures, and now you grab the opposition, and of course, it's still a draw. And for those of you, if for some reason still don't believe it's a draw, after king e4, you go king e2, f4, king to f2, we have f3 now. King to f1, not e1 of course, king to e3, now again you grab the opposition, f2 check, king f1 and king f3, and it's a draw by stalemate. And if this comes as news to you, then you should definitely start with some endgame lessons. So yeah, after rook captures on c4, they agreed to a draw of course, and what a wild game. So really, it's a game that could have had a lot of impact on the match, and well, And the reason why, probably in my opinion, why Nepo missed the knight to h4 idea, he didn't spend too much time in the position, and he didn't expect there to be such a tricky win against a player of Fabi's caliber. But yeah, like I always say, it's chess, anything can happen, and here it didn't happen. So that's game 2 of their match. I do hope you enjoyed it. Really a wild game. I would like to thank Kathal Prendergast for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Magnus Invitational. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your Sunday.